Welcome to The Controversial Truth, where we bring you content on health and medical science that nobody would ever tell you until now. I'm your host, Dr. Victoria Munoz, and today we have a very special episode for you. Stay tuned. So in terms of our talk about health today, I get some very interesting questions. So I thought I would come here and I would answer those just to help clarify how carnivore works for your life in general, not just for working out, not for any other reason except that it is the perfect human diet. The reason I say this is because over millennia, we have evolved eating fatty red meat. It has only been for about the last 100 to 120 years that we have incorporated carbohydrates into our diet. And that is when we started seeing chronic disease at an exponential rate. In terms of cancers, autoimmune disease, neuromuscular diseases like MS. With the onset of farming and manufactured foods, we started seeing illness at an exponential rate. We're not herbivores, we're not omnivores, we're obligate carnivores. So, that being said, one question I get is how can we survive without carbohydrates? Well, carbohydrates were meant to be a backup fuel. We were absolutely, positively not meant to be cycling through these insulin spikes all day long as a result of eating carbohydrates in our diet. What happens is we eat carbs, our insulin spikes, and then it comes back down to baseline. Eventually, what's going to happen is that insulin will not come down to baseline anymore, and you're going to end up with something that's called insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance isn't something that we can measure. We were able to determine insulin resistance based on other measures. And one thing I do test with all my patients is fasting insulin. Insulin will spike and insulin will become an issue long before we'll see hemoglobin A1C go up or even fasting glucose. Fasting glucose is not really a good measure of where your health status is. The reason for that is because fasting glucose can change very quickly. Your hemoglobin A1C does not. Your hemoglobin A1C is a measure of your blood sugar over a 3-month period. So especially when we're monitoring diabetics, looking at the hemoglobin A1C will help us determine how well treatment is working. Now, with a doctor like myself, I typically get people out of the diabetic state and into a state of health. So we're not really monitoring diabetes per se at that point. What we're doing is we're ensuring that the patient stays in a state of health, and that's what we ultimately want. Many doctors will tell you that diabetes is a lifelong sentence and you'll have to be on medication for the rest of your life. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is not the case. Now, it's a little different with type 1 diabetes, but that's where the carnivore diet comes in. And the carnivore diet, basically, in a nutshell, prevents you from needing insulin because you're not consuming the carbohydrates that require the insulin to help to metabolize that as fuel. Now, in terms of fuel, the cell will choose its fuel source based on what is mostly available. So if you're eating carbohydrates and you have a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, then glucose is going to be the fuel of choice for the cell. If you are on a carnivore diet, ketogenic diet, I personally am on a carnivore diet. I've been carnivore for over a year now. I went into the carnivore diet from a ketogenic diet. So that being said, it was still challenging. You can imagine that it is challenging to go from a moderate to high glucose diet to carnivore, which is zero carbs, essentially. You do get some carbohydrate in protein sources like meat, but what we're qualifying it with is that our diet is animal based. Okay, so that being said, when you go from eating high carbs to a carnivore diet, it can be pretty challenging. And that's why a lot of people give up, because you've spent how many decades jacking up your metabolism with carbohydrates, and then you try and go carnivore. It's going to be very challenging, number one. Number two, It's going to possibly put you into a toxic state as the cells release toxins from all the plant foods that you've been eating over decades. So when you're consuming carbohydrates on a regular basis, most people are eating every 2 to 4 hours, which is another problem, then the body has a way of dealing with this. What happens is when you eat carbohydrates, the beta cells from your pancreas release insulin. You consume carbohydrates, it doesn't matter what form you consume carbohydrates in, whether it is a complex or a simple carbohydrate. Well, for example, sucrose is a disaccharide. It is glucose and fructose. However, once it enters into the bloodstream, it is a monosaccharide, meaning it's broken down into its simple sugars, fructose and glucose. When you eat complex carbohydrates, same thing. It doesn't matter what form it comes in. By the time it enters the bloodstream, it is a monosaccharide. So the body doesn't know the difference between a whole wheat bread, for example, or a piece of candy. Once that monosaccharide has entered the bloodstream, the body has a protective mechanism, and that is the release of insulin to pull the glucose out of the blood and into the cell. The reason for that is because glucose is toxic to every cell in the body. Now, fructose, on the other hand, will go directly to the liver. It is 7 to 10 times more toxic to every cell in the human body than glucose, so it is taken up very quickly by the liver. However, that doesn't mean that it's okay. Over time, your liver will become very sick, and that results in fatty liver disease. We have alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is the only fatty liver that we knew for a very long time. And then as we started consuming fructose, high fructose corn syrup in all these processed foods, then we started seeing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is the same disease process, except it's being caused by fructose. There's no form of fructose that is healthy for human consumption, whether it's fruit or whether it comes in processed foods. It is all toxic to the human body. Okay, so back to the cell and how it determines its fuel source. Well, we've pretty much jacked ourselves up by consuming carbohydrates all day, every day, and we've been told that this is healthy, which it is not healthy. It is basically a message that's been given to you by a big corporation to encourage you to eat processed foods, including manufactured fruits and vegetables. Yes, I said manufactured fruits and vegetables. There is not a single piece of produce that you can purchase in the grocery store in its natural form. If any of those fruits or vegetables were in their natural state, they'd be too toxic for human consumption. These fruits and vegetables have been manufactured to be less toxic so that it doesn't kill you right away and higher in carbohydrate. So there's no fruit or vegetable that's safe for human consumption. I do have patients that don't want to be strict carnivore and they want to incorporate some carbohydrates back into their diet. We typically do a 90-day metabolic reset. And so what we do is we very carefully incorporate one thing at a time back into the diet to see if they can tolerate it. Once we reset your metabolism, you will have more obvious symptoms when it comes to consuming these foods. Before, when you were so metabolically sick, it was hard to tell what kind of symptoms you were having because you just didn't feel good in general. Once your metabolism is fixed, then the reactions become more obvious. So basically, what we do is we incorporate one food at a time back into the diet, and this will be a fruit or vegetable. This is not starchy vegetables. This is not grains. This is not processed or manufactured foods. This is just specifically fruit or vegetable that you may want to incorporate back into the diet. You do it one food at a time. You eat a substantial amount of that one food for a 3-day period, and you watch for brain fog, joint pain, muscle aches, insomnia, bloating, and so forth. If you experience any of these types of symptoms, then that food is contraindicated completely. Nonetheless, I tell my patients you got to stay under 20 grams of carbs a day, period. Okay? You start going over that, and you're going to start running into problems. And there is no human that will not eventually have problems based on eating carbohydrates in the diet. So back to the cell and how it determines its fuel source. Well, when you're consuming carbohydrates, of course, glucose is going to be the fuel source. That doesn't mean it's ideal. It just means that the Cell is taking in this glucose to get it out of the blood. It will metabolize it through a series of biochemical cycles, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain. And if glucose is what's being utilized for fuel, then the cell has a feedback mechanism where it will block the ability for free fatty acids to come into the cell. Okay, if you are eating a carnivore diet, for example, and fatty acids are the primary source of fuel available, then the cell will take in the fatty acids for fuel and block the ability for glucose to enter the cell. Okay, what this is called the Randle cycle. It is much more complex than how I'm explaining it now. However, when you're eating a mixed diet of fats and carbs, this can create some chaos with the cell and make it very difficult for it to determine what fuel source to take in at any given time. Okay, so that's the Randle cycle. We're not going to go into great detail in the Randle cycle right now. However, just know that if you're consuming carbohydrates, the carbohydrates is what will be used as fuel for the production of ATP, which is your energy source. And if you're eating a ketogenic diet of less than 20 grams a day or a carnivore diet, then free fatty acids is what's available for fuel, and that is what the cell will utilize for its fuel source. That being said, it doesn't mean that carbohydrates are an ideal fuel source. We have protective mechanisms such as insulin to pull the carbohydrate into the cell when it's circulating in the blood, and we are able to use it as fuel. It was only meant to be a backup source of fuel. Through our millennia of evolution, there were times when we couldn't come across wild game for food. We had to depend on some kind of plant source like berries until we could get back to our ideal fuel source, which is fatty red meat. Okay? Fatty red meat produces everything that you need for life. Okay? It has all the vitamins, minerals, including vitamin C. In fact, the C in vitamin C stands for collagen. So if you're consuming fatty red meat, you're getting an abundance of collagen in your diet and you need less vitamin C. The reason that the British sailors got scurvy is because they were basically on a potato diet. They had virtually no collagen in their diet. The limes essentially saved them. That doesn't mean you have to consume citrus fruit for your source of vitamin C. You can get all the vitamin C that you need in fatty red meat if you're a carnivore. Okay? So, another question I get is, well, how can I fuel my workout? I work with recreational athletes, I work with competitive athletes, I work with pro athletes. When they come to me on a standard carbohydrate based diet, this is the big question that they have. How am I going to be able to get through my workouts without carbohydrates? We're so conditioned to believe that we need carbohydrates that it is going to take re educating these individuals to help them understand how they can utilize fatty acids for fuel. Going back to our previous conversation about how the cell determines its fuel source, well, what's available? Is the majority of what's available glucose or is it free fatty acids? There's your answer. So when you eat a carnivore diet, it's the free fatty acids. They're utilized by the cell to produce ATP, and you get the same, if not better, drive in your workouts and muscle gains as well. Okay? The beauty of the carnivore diet is that your cholesterol goes up. Yes, you do want high cholesterol. Let me explain. Cholesterol is not the culprit in disease. Cholesterol does not cause heart disease, period. Cholesterol is important for the production of our sex hormones. If we don't have adequate cholesterol, we are not able to produce testosterone. Testosterone is our natural anabolic steroid that we produce naturally. Many people are on TRT, which is testosterone replacement therapy, because they are on a plant-based diet. Testosterone's in the tank. So what do? They inject it as a result. I do prescribe testosterone to patients that need it. However, my patients that go carnivore need less, if any at all. So we need cholesterol to produce our hormones, or we need cholesterol to produce vitamin D. Without cholesterol, we cannot produce vitamin D and we cannot produce CoQ10. CoQ10 is a very, very powerful antioxidant and it is required for the production of ATP. So, what are you dependent on? Are you dependent on glucose? Are you dependent on fatty acids for fuel? Well, the next question is, well, why can't I use glucose for fuel? Well, I kind of just answered that question in that glucose is toxic to every cell in the body, inside and outside the cell. Insulin is released when you consume carbohydrates as a protective mechanism to pull that glucose into the cell. Once it's in the cell will use it as fuel. However, that doesn't mean that glucose is an ideal fuel source for the cell. When you're functioning on fatty acids are absolutely positively not toxic to any cell in the human body, and it is a more ideal fuel source. After I went carnivore, it took me about a month to really feel my energy come back in the gym. I was struggling a little bit until then, but it takes a while to become fat adapted. Don't think that right after you become carnivore that everything's just going to turn around for the better. It's not. And that's why I recommend working with a doctor like myself for the best results. And it does take some time to become fat adapted. Okay, this isn't something that happens overnight. Anyway, guys, I know this was a long video. I just wanted to come here and answer some questions. If you haven't liked this video, please do so. Subscribe to the channel so that I can bring you more cool content like this video today. Also, leave a comment below if there's any questions you might have about carnivore diet, about health, about fitness, and I'm happy to bring those here. I'm Dr. Victoria Munoz. Till next time, take care.